So I'm sitting here with Dinga Sikwebu, who's been very active with the trade union movements in South Africa. We're sitting in WITS University. Dinga, can you briefly introduce yourself?
All right. My name is Dinga Sikwebu, and I am a retired unionist. I've been active in the labor movement since 1980, in, out, but I can say that I've spent the best part of my adult life as a trade unionist.
Okay, and what are you doing now?
At the moment, I am a pensioner, but I also do some work for the Global Labor University, where I am heading a mentoring program for trade unionists on the just transition. That's what I do. I'm also studying. I am a recipient of the Emancipatory Futures Scholarship, and I'm doing my master's through that program.
Okay, well, that sounds very interesting. So tell me, because you just mentioned just transitions. Now, back in India, and I guess in many other parts of the world, there's been a historical tension between the ecological and more currently the climate movement and, say, the workers' movements, especially trade unions. Here, I think you tried bridging that gap for a number of years. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And what were unions doing in terms of arguing for a just transition?
Look, I mean, we tried to make it quite clear that the issue of climate change is a workers' issue. It's a trade union issue. The people who, in many ways, inhale the pollution that comes from fossil fuel, if they work in a coal mine, if they work in a power plant, are workers. So, I mean, to argue that the issues of the environment are not workers' issues is naive. So the work that we did was to emphasize the question that after all is said and done, it is the workers, it is the poor communities that will suffer more than any other strata in society when the consequences of climate change and ecological degradation take place. The rich are able to fortify themselves. They're able to move. In fact, they've built their infrastructure and houses in places that will not be affected. So that was the central message that we drove. And we began this work on the environment in 2002 within the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, and it stopped a bit, and then we restarted it in 2011. As I say to many people, the fact that we had two events in South Africa, the World Summit on Sustainable Development and COP17 in 2011 meant that we could somehow make the issue quite urgent, and we utilize this to put on the agenda the questions of climate change and ecological degradation.
But I mean, how was it in terms of reaching out to your own worker colleagues? Was there skepticism about this, or did people kind of soon see the logic of what you're talking about?
Look, I mean, from the word go, when we did the work, I would say that the workers had anxieties. They were anxious about jobs, they were anxious about their livelihoods, and I mean, what I learned from that is that, for instance, the question of climate change, when we spoke about it and spoke about the potential of jobs in the renewable energy sector, that did not have the resonance amongst workers. And quite soon I realized that we were treating workers in a unidimensional manner. as if they were just workers, producers. But I remember a workshop I ran in one of our cities for workers. When we began to speak to what the effects of climate change are to farmers, small-scale farmers, this had resonance, and people could relate stories about changing climate condition, changing weather patterns, because the workers are not just producers in a factory. They also have a small piece of land in the countryside, and this relationship between the worker and what happens in the sphere of production, it's only when we could connect the two that workers could relate to this. So the lesson that I learned from doing some of the education work was that don't treat workers as just in this sort of singular way. Workers have all these multiple dimensions. And yeah, anxieties were there, but we had to sort of broaden what the impact of climate change, not just to the workplace, but also to communities. And I think it's through that that people began to understand. I think if I could say, I mean, this was more than 10 years ago, and at that point we were talking about maybe things that would come or that were happening. I think the last 10 years in terms of the climate shocks and what's happening is that I think more people, even those who were skeptical at that point, would not deny what's happening around them.
It's very, very visible, yeah. But there must still be, I mean, back home in India, one of the biggest problems is that if, for instance, coal mining has to be stopped and we shift to something else, how does that transition actually take place? Who should be responsible for making sure that workers are able to transition to other occupations, right? The reskilling or the retraining or all of that. So was that part of your vision as to what would be the process of transition itself?
Okay, I mean, we had a discussion on what the transition should be all about. And the first thing that we made it quite clear, and we were converging as a union on, was that workers and people of the global south are not responsible for the situation that we find. And secondly, that ordinary people, their contribution to climate change in some of the instances is very minuscule. It's very small. And we did hang on to some of the principles of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, of a common but differentiated responsibility. We said those who've put us into this situation, in this mess, have to bear this sort of responsibility. That is not to deny that we have a responsibility. So if we're talking about the just transition, then the global north, corporations, the fossil fuel industry, the rich, have an important and a more significant role to play. And I think that when we came from this political angle, people began to see that the struggle against sort of global warming, for mitigation on climate change, was intertwined with a broader struggle to transform society, to change the economic system. And being in a very politicized union, this had resonance amongst them.
And did it go beyond the metalworkers union to the other unions also?
Look, I mean, we started working on this as the metalworkers in NUMSA, but we were clear that we were to influence unions in the federation that we were affiliated onto, which is the Congress of South Africa.
The race this evening is? Okay.
Yeah.
Which is the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And we took some of the resolutions into COSATU, and I would say that we were able to influence the Trade Union Center in South Africa. But the positions that we were taking did not just influence the trade union movement. The environmental groups, the climate justice movement, which had, I would say, a view that what was needed was to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy, began also to be influenced, because when we began to say, okay, if we move to renewable energy, the questions of who will own the renewable energies, where will they be produced, for what will they be produced, is it for profit or is it to change the system? When we introduced those questions that were not uppermost in the climate justice movement, I think people began also to be influenced and to take the questions seriously.
Okay. And what was the sort of response you got from the government?
Look, I mean, the government, the South African government was, I mean, on some of the issues, they listened. In the course of the work, we did meet with the ministers and government departments, and I would say that, for instance, on the questions of localization and ensuring that some of the renewable energy technologies that these were manufactured in South Africa. So through the work, we were able to work with the government, and I would say with the sort of the manufacturing industry to talk about localization and local content requirements, and we were able to ensure that some of these are put in place. Look, on another level, I do think that our government was sort of naive, in the same way as we were using the fact that South Africa was hosting COP17. The South African government also was quite keen to putting up a show for the people that were going to come into the country. So in many ways, some of what was done was also part of just showmanship. And secondly, I think that the fact that these investments were being provided by the private sector somehow lulled our government, because they were arguing that, look, we're not putting any money as the state. These are private investors, these are independent power producers, and this is costing the state nothing. Now, I mean, we're quite to point out that the private investors were not going to come and invest in South Africa and in the renewable projects if, for instance, the South African government was not underwriting some of the projects. Also, although many people say this is a private sector initiative, it's supported by the state. I mean, in South Africa, the utility company, which is Eskom, the electricity utility company, is an off-taker of the private sector produced power. And they wouldn't invest if power purchase agreements were not signed. So I do think that, I mean, the government somehow was sort of drawn into this naive argument that this was a private sector and that this will be a win-win situation. And when we made a strong case for what we call socially owned renewable sector and the involvement of the state, of establishing cooperatives in this, they for instance didn't believe or buy what we were saying, but they didn't dismiss it outrightly. And for instance, there was a what I call a league where projects that produce less than 5 megawatts and they were pushing that the socially owned renewable sector that we were advocating, maybe we should play in the small league. And our view was that why should we play in the small league and allow the private sector to play in the Premier League?
Right. I mean, in terms of the rhetoric on green transition, so I was fortunate to visit the Komati power station where there's supposed to be a green transition taking place, right? But we didn't see much evidence of that other than panels that Eskom has put up about it. So where do you think things have kind of not gone, I mean, or let's say, what needs to happen for the real green transitions or just transitions to actually take place?
Look, I mean, I think what we've seen or is unfolding in South Africa is an unjust transition. A lot of people talk about a just transition when unjust transitions are happening around us. The sort of private sector driven transition is very unjust. And some of the changes that have happened in South Africa point to the unjust nature of the transition. I mean, for instance, the South African government has announced that embedded generation can commence. People can put panels on rooftops. But I mean, with living in a sort of an unequal society like South Africa, who can afford putting all these solar panels on their rooftops? It's the rich. And what's happening with the rich and the middle classes putting these solar panels on their rooftops? It's a migration of many electricity consumers from municipalities to being the so-called prosumers. And this takes away revenue that local states were making and which were used for cross-subsidization for other services. And whilst there's an announcement that people can have this rooftop sort of rollout, the program that was introduced at the instigation of the labor movement, which was to roll out of solar water heaters for poor households, has been stopped. So I mean, if you want to tell me that's justice, then I don't know what you're talking about. So I mean, I can talk about many of the changes that have happened, but the effect of all of this is to accelerate the production of electricity by independent power producers, and so we are seeing many companies migrating off grid. And putting up installations that will make themselves self-sufficient. And these were sort of customers that were subsidizing poor households before. So I do think that we do spend a lot of time talking about a just transition instead of saying what are we going to do to critique and resist the unjust transition that is that's unfolding. And to say what should happen, I mean, I do think that some of the initiatives that are being done now, some of them in South Africa are too little, too late. For instance, we had argued, for instance, that the electricity utility, the public utility, should be allowed to move into the renewable energy space. Until October last year, no organ of the state at a national level or even at sub-national level could be involved in renewable energy programs. You know, they were barred.
Oh, really? Wow.
They were barred. We don't see, as we proposed, a rollout of cooperatives, energy cooperatives. We're also not seeing a rollout of an encouragement of community energy companies. Because when we spoke about a socially owned renewable sector, we were not just talking about state ownership. We were talking about a mix of different forms of ownership, ranging from cooperatives to community energy companies to parastatals at sub-national levels.
So much more democratic forms of...
And in a way, decentralized with some community control over this. And unfortunately, this has not happened. And instead, what we are seeing in the panic of a blackouts and shortage of electricity, we're seeing a liberalization of the electricity markets, with independent power producers being given the space to do generation.
So it's an even more challenging situation now, which means that much more mobilization of mass movements, workers' unions, if they can come back into this, environmental groups, etc.
Look, I mean, I think so, but the unfortunate thing is that our labor movement, the pendulum has swung the other way because of the unjust transition that they've been experiencing. They have swung, I would argue, behind the sort of coal lobby. So it's not easy that we could just put things together, because what has happened is that from people's experiences, it has put particularly the labor movement behind fossil fuel interests. And so it's put us in a very difficult situation from what was possible about building a united front between communities, climate justice movement, and the labor movement.
Well, Dinga, thanks a lot for this conversation. It doesn't look very bright at the moment, but then things can change. And we hope that not just in South Africa, but sort of global solidarity around these issues can begin to swing things around again.
Thank you. As I say, we live in hope, and without hope, I don't think we'll be able to confront the challenges that face us. Thank you for that, and good luck with your work here.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Thank you.
I hope.